Our scripture reading continues with a reading from Isaiah by June.
A reading from the book of Isaiah. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice cries out, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Hear the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. And our next scripture reading by Jorge from Titus.
En lecture du livre de Titus. Car la grâce de Dieu, source de salut pour tous les hommes, a été manifestée. Et il nous enseigne à renoncer l'impiété à une convoitise mondaine et à vivre dans les siècles présents selon la sagesse, la justice et la piété, en attendant la bienheureuse espérance et la manifestation de la gloire de notre grand Dieu et Sauveur Jésus-Christ. Écoute la parole du Seigneur.
Nous rendons grâce à Dieu. Welcome again, Roger, and we just pray God's blessing on you as you share with us this morning.
Many thanks. Thank you. So my understanding, Chris, is this morning that if I just share a few thoughts for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for any questions or thoughts or perhaps reflections that you might have on it as well.
Yep, that would be great.
Great. So this morning, I'm just going to share a few things with you about hope. And hope is something I've studied not only theologically, but also as a psychologist as well, in terms of looking at it from the sort of the scientific point of view. But also I think it's something that all of us need experientially. You know, we need it in our lives in all kinds of different ways. So a few years back, I was saying to people just before you all came on that my wife is Irish. And a few years back, we were traveling around Ireland together in the back of a van. And it was our summer holiday. And I was watching on my phone a film made by the band Sigur Rós. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're an Icelandic band who have this sort of very strange, ethereal, beautiful music. And in 2006, they'd toured the world, and they decided that when they got back to Iceland, what they really wanted to do was put on free shows for all their fans. So they toured around Iceland, and they went to all these different strange venues, a field and a fish factory, and different village halls out in rural Iceland, and they performed their music. And there's one particular section in that where they're singing a song. They're in a small village hall. There's about as many people in the hall as there probably are on the call today. People of all different ages, old, young, children, all kinds of different identities in the room, all crammed into this small village hall in Iceland together. And the band sing. And the moment this section of the film started, I just found myself weeping. I couldn't work out, why am I crying about this? Really strange. So a few hours later, I showed it to my wife, Marie Claire, and as she watched it, I cried again. And of course, we were then going to visit her parents because we were back with family in Ireland, and I showed it to them, and I cried again, which I was only just at the beginning of my relationship with them. It was a bit embarrassing at that point in time. And so we're going to bed that night, and Marie Claire turns to me, she says, "What is it about this that makes you cry?" And I had to really think hard and sort of put my finger on, what is it about this bit of footage that makes me so emotional, that moves me so deeply? And I said, because on one hand, it feels good, it feels lovely, it feels warm, all those people together in this sort of lovely communal atmosphere, listening to this beautiful music. But at the same time, it makes me feel sad because life is so often not like that. And life is quite often difficult and hard, and bad things happen. And I was trying to put together, what is this strange thing? On the one hand, it feels good. On the other hand, it feels so fragile and so difficult to get a handle on. And I said, do you know what? it's hope. That watching that bit of footage gives me hope. And then a few years later, I was getting ready to give a lecture on hope to some of my students at the university. I was talking about the psychology of it. And I thought, well, I'll show them this footage and tell them that story. And just before I did, I thought, well, I better look up what it's about because they're singing in a language I don't understand. So I should probably understand what's going on there. And the song was called Von. Von was what the song was called. And as I looked up the details, it turns out that it isn't in Icelandic. It's actually in a completely nonsense language, a language of sort of nonsense syllables that they called Von Lenska, or in other words, they called it Hope Landic. In other words, the song was about hope, and it had been written in a language that they felt just expressed hope, even though it didn't mean anything. And that's how I feel about hope when I talk to you about it today, that hope is this sort of fragile atmosphere, that it's this sense, on one hand, we're yearning for a better future. At the same time, it's sort of tantalizing because we're a bit nervous and apprehensive that we dare hope that the future could be better. We sort of sit with that feeling that you heard in the passage from Isaiah. Could it be? Could it be that we will see the goodness of God in real time, in real life, as has been promised? It feels like something that we almost daren't breathe. And the thing is that I think for many of us, probably this period of pandemic has, what we could describe it as a period of hope death, a difficult time where perhaps many of the plans we had for last year, this year, plans to meet people, plans to do things have sort of died and become stuck. And those moments are really, really painful for us as human beings. And the reason they're painful is because to be human is to be future orientated. You know, who we are becoming is a large part of who we are right now. And if we're going to function productively as people, we need a positive, realistic future that we're working towards. And things get very difficult for us if we lose our sense of hope. And so I think for many of us, lockdown has been that sort of moment, almost like a crucifixion point, where many of the things that we may have held dear, that seemed precious, that were really important, have died in some way. But the interesting thing about a crucifixion point is every moment of crucifixion is also a place of resurrection. As the poet Rumi once said, where there is ruin, there is hope of a treasure. And we look at some of the things we used to hope for, and we think some of them maybe were a bit inappropriate, or maybe they were fragile, or they were petty, they were minor, maybe we didn't really want them anyway. And sometimes, if you're anything like me, as some of those sort of minor hopes fall apart, you begin to realize there's this stream of deeper hope, this deeper magic, as C.S. Lewis put it, this sort of deeper stream of life working through us. So today I'm just going to say four things that psychologists would tell us that hopeful people believe. Behind these sort of four things, you could say, biblically, there's this sense of one great hope, that if you read the narrative, the story of the Bible, what you find is that behind all of that, it only makes sense in the context of there will be this moment when life is restored, where things get better, where I think, as Isaiah put it, the glory of the Lord shall be revealed and all flesh shall see it together. This moment where we will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Now that's not to say that goodness is absent now. It's just not yet predominant. I'm quite a big fan of the sci-fi writer William Gibson. And one of the things he said is, the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. So the four things that hopeful people tend to believe are these. The first thing hopeful people believe is that they believe no matter how bitter the present may be, there is a better future. So they believe there's a better future ahead. So quite often we can look at the world and think, oh man, it's all gone to pot. It's all fallen to pieces. But as we heard from Paul writing to Titus, thanks to Jesus, we can see the glory of God in the land of the living. This idea that Jesus appearing is almost a sign that the good things of God are still there. They still will appear. And if we believe that there's a better future, hopeful people tend to practice what some people call nexting, not texting, nexting. Nexting is, what next? I know right now this is tough, but what next? I know right now life has been hard, but what next? I know right now I've been dealing with bereavement and sickness and fatigue, but what next? It's this idea that there is a better future to come. The second thing that hopeful people believe is that we all have something to contribute in bringing that future about. We have to have some skin in the game. We have to get involved in bringing about that better future, and maybe not even in dramatic ways, maybe in quite small, subtle ways. We read that passage again from Isaiah where John the Baptist is talking about in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. You'll notice that over the years, the punctuation in that passage has changed. It used to say, the voice is one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. And then we realized that actually, no, John the Baptist is saying it's in the wilderness that the way of the Lord is being prepared. It's in these empty, difficult places that we are being invited to participate in what God would like to do. And when I think about hope in this way, I almost think it's like surfing. I've spent quite a few summers in Ireland surfing on the Atlantic. Surfing on the Atlantic, I think, is just like surfing, in California on the Pacific, except that it's freezing and there are no waves. But other than that, it's just the same. And if you've ever surfed, ever done any of those bodyboarding or anything like that, you know that what you do is you make yourself available to the wave. You don't try and stop the wave. You can't stop the sea. But you're actively scanning the horizon saying, when does the next wave come and how can I position myself to be able to take it? So hopeful people believe the future will be better. They also believe that they'll have to capture that in some way. They'll have to contribute. The other thing hopeful people believe is they believe there are many paths into that future. I think quite often our hope falls apart when we can't imagine how a better future could ever come about. But the idea of there being many possible paths into a better future means that sometimes all you need to do is take a small step. Which neighbor is it that you made contact with this week? What phone call did you make? What short prayer? What kind word? Which card did you deliver? What are those very, very small things that you can do that are just small, tiny steps we can take into that better future? And we never know which of those actions will be the fluttering of the butterfly that starts a hurricane, or the faithless prayers that calls up something wondrous, a fantastic coincidence. So hopeful people believe there is a better future. They believe that they have to contribute to it. They believe there's many ways of getting there. And they believe that no single path into the future is free of obstacles. Hope doesn't mean that the smooth path into the future will be easy. I think sometimes we think we've lost our way or the path is too hard. But those are the moments when hope can refresh us, even in the face of dead ends or unexpected twists and turns. You remember the children's story? Sometimes we can't go over it. We can't go under it. We've got to go through it. And that's again why we read in that passage of Isaiah that God comforts, that God speaks tenderly, that God pardons. Very often during those moments of obstacles and difficulties where it's difficult to see what the future would be, we need to experience the love, the compassion, the presence of God with us, both for ourselves and in our community of belief. There is a better future. We make a contribution to it. There are many ways to get there, and all of them will have obstacles in it. Let me finish with one final story. Again, a few years back, a friend of mine was the head teacher of a local school here in Lincoln. And she was having a very tough time at a school in a very difficult area of the city. She went on holiday to an area in the northeast of England. I was talking to some people earlier who have relatives in that part of the country, and she went to Holy Island, to Lindisfarne, which is largely viewed as the place where the Celts, Celtic Christians, sort of evangelized the whole of England from that among many different places. And there's still a monastic order that live on the island to this day. And this friend of mine went into the chapel there, and she was sat in the chapel and she was crying about the school and saying, I don't know what to do with it. It's really, really hard. And as she sat there, one of the monks drew alongside her and said, what are you crying about? And she explained the situation. And he said, okay, well, why don't we arrange together that your children will make a banner? We'll put it in our chapel here. And then whenever we look at it, we will remember your school and we'll pray for you. So about 6 months later, this absolutely crazy thing happens of 2 huge buses full of these, 9, 10, 11-year-olds, all crazily getting really excited, drive 3 hours north from where we are here to Lindisfarne, to Holy Island, and they have this wonderful Sunday service where they parade this banner that they've made through the church, and the priest there receives it, and they put it on the wall, and they agree to pray for that school. And wonderful day. They think, isn't that fantastic? And then just as it's all about to end, suddenly the organist, who, unlike Stephen, had an organ that day, stopped playing and runs to the front of the church. He says, I've got to tell you something. I've got to say something. And everybody thinks this is unusual. And he said, what I need you to know is that my mother used to work in your school. And he named the street that she lived on in our city here. And she lived literally just around the corner from where I am now. And he said she died a few years ago. But when she worked in that school, the school seemed to be completely closed to anything that would be of God, really. It wasn't interested in any of those things. But I know that throughout her retirement, before she died, she prayed every single day for your school. And it was almost like that moment was the fulfillment of our prayers. And I just think of that lady who we never met, who even in her old age, even confined to her home, she still contributed. She still built something. She set up a wave that she never saw, but which other people rode. And I think, in a sense, that's what we do when we contribute to hope. We all have something to give. We all have something to work with. And I'll just finish with the words of the poet Steve Turner that you may have heard. He has a really short poem in which he just says this. He says, these are the good old days. Just wait and see. So I'll come back to you then, Chris, from there, and maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the things I've said or other ideas that people may want to bring.
I think, Fiona, I'll turn it over to you. You're muted. You're on mute.
I'm on mute and I'm pausing because I'm taking notes. So I'm just so blessed by that, and I'm sure all of us are. So as we often do, we have an interaction around the message, and so people might have questions or comments that they're already ready with.
Sorry, I'm just seeing Tim is saying, could you just recap the four things? Certainly, yeah. Let me just recap those, because they do go by quite quickly, don't they? So the four things are, there is a better future. We have a contribution to make to that future. That there are many ways of getting there. And all of them have obstacles.
Thanks for the summary. Does anybody have a question or comment right off the bat? And make sure you take off your mute.
Yes, I do. So I'd like to ask Roger. He gave a quote from, I think it was a writer by William Gibson, but I didn't catch the whole quote. So could you repeat it? Yeah,
so William Gibson is a science fiction writer. So and he thinks a lot about the future and technology and things like that. And so he said, the future is already here. It just isn't very evenly distributed.
Evenly distributed. Okay, good. Yeah. Thank you.
So I really like that quote, because it's that idea of we already have the seeds of the future, the goodness around us. We just often miss them, and they seem to be, clustered in one place and completely missing in other places.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Roger, you've been kind of talking. I'm for a kind of an individual level, what we do individually. What does it take to create communities of hope?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris, and it relates very. I mean, psychologists do tend to be quite individualistic, and I acknowledge that. So I think a community of hope is a community in which we hold that hope for one another. I think about some of the depressed people that I work with or I've known personally in church. And very often what I've found is that they don't have much hope, but actually a community can hold hope for them, can see a better future for them. I also tend to find the same thing might come if you have people who have progressive diseases or have chronic pain. People are suffering all kinds of forms of dementia and things like that. I think quite often the community actually holds hope for those people. That's one of the things that gives them enormous dignity. And then I think also just in a sort of much more everyday kind of way as well, I think we hold hope for one another that we are becoming more like Christ together as a community. And I know there are moments when I've almost lost my way or felt quite stuck, and I've found other people around me have held hope on my behalf, and I've really appreciated it.
Thank you.
So Sarah in Guinea is asking for the name of the Icelandic band.
Yes, I'm just typing in, so it's Sigaros. In fact, and if you want to see Von, the actual thing I'm talking about, it's actually on YouTube, the entire thing. So I think if you put Sigaros Heimer or Von into YouTube, you're likely to be able to find it. The poem is by Steve Turner. And Steve Turner is it was sort of friends with Eric Clapton and things like that, but also a Christian, used to write for the New Musical Express. And so kind of a bit of a rock star in some ways, but used to write some really, really pithy, lovely poems like that. So those two lines, that literally is the whole poem. These are the good old days. Just wait and see. That's the poem.
Something that is really hopeful in what you just said is becoming more like Christ to one another, and holding that hope for one another, I think is really challenging when we think because we're in a hopeless or depressed state, that's the end. We've blown it. It's not going to work out. And that whole sense of our interrelatedness is really quite countercultural, I think.
Yeah. I noticed, Stephen, did you put your hand up a moment ago?
I just wanted to mention to the group in general to remind you that it seems like there's quite a bit to process sometimes in a sermon and a message, and just to never forget that these sermons are available shortly after the service and at this point in perpetuity as far as we go along with YouTube. So just don't forget, you can always click on that link and fast forward through a whole bunch of stuff and get to the sermon and give it another listen, because there was a lot in there. I'm seeing people asking for links and names of things. Just that reference is there. Don't forget to use it
Through our website and the polls.
Okay. So I can put my notes into the chat now as well, so you can have those. And then the other thing, someone's asked for the link to Sigaros. So I think before we finish, I'll just go online and find that for you, because I know where it is.
And then there, Tim, is number 3 connecting to splitting or all or nothing thinking? So number 3, the belief that there are many possible.
Yes. Yeah. So that's exactly right. So sometimes what happens is, and that's clearly someone with some good psychological knowledge going on there. So I think what sometimes happens is, firstly, we can put all our eggs in one basket and think if this doesn't work out, everything has failed. So partly it's saying that kind of as we're beginning to think about how we develop our lives, we need to think about, investing in all aspects of our life, not just putting everything there. And then splitting psychologically, yeah, so that's the tendency of putting all the bad stuff outside of ourselves and just seeing the goodness in us, or sometimes the other way around. So this is what happens when communities split, really, is you end up seeing evil, outside of yourself and not really taking responsibility for it inside. And I think both points 3 and 4, so both there are many things and all of them are difficult, I think allow us to integrate that actually in hope sort of incorporates those moments where we could equally despair. That's when hope becomes really useful. It's those moments where despair would be just as feasible response. So I think what this definition of hope does is it stops us embracing a sort of pink fluffy unicorns dancing on rainbows version of hope, and instead says, yeah, hope is about a sort of tussle and a wrestle and a sort of interaction with life. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Others?
Heather, I see Heather's hand.
Yeah.
Roger, I'm wondering, sometimes I'm wondering if you think that we often roll with the metaphor of two roads diverging in a wood, the forks in the road, the thing we did, the turn we shouldn't have taken, that we can undo, and so in our head, there's this sort of idea that we missed it, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever it was. But what you're saying in point 3 sounds to me like, no, there's like multiple footpaths up the mountain at any given time.
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right, Heather. And I've encountered that with a lot of people during the pandemic, actually. So a lot of people I've spoken to have sort of, they're locked down with their family, or they're locked down in a situation that feels less than ideal. And it's put them almost in a sort of nostalgic kind of pattern where they're looking back and thinking, my life doesn't feel good now. If only I hadn't X, Y, Z, whatever it is. And it's almost like there's this twin road that they could have taken and still exists. And it's like they're living as if they could be there. And for me, this is one of those areas where that kind of connection of hope to love and faith becomes really, really important, because I think hope is saying there still is a future no matter what decision we made back there. Faith, on the other hand, I think is that piece that says that the grace of God is still there for us, that we didn't lose all the opportunities because of some decision we took back some other time, that faith is this idea of God kind of upholding us in his grace through that period of time. And then I think that sort of idea of actually sitting and seeing the love of God every day in all kinds of small ways, appreciating that in gratitude, appreciating it in all the small signs we see in daily life, that there is still goodness in the world, and really savoring that and enjoying it. So I think that's a really, really profound question. And I think it speaks sometimes to that sort of idea that what can happen to us is that we can live so much in regret that we start missing the good things that are happening now. I remember a client I once had who used to go on about how they regretted things for a whole hour, and then they'd say they'd missed their life, and I'd say, and you've just missed another hour of your life by living in regret as well. So I think hope and faith and love just invite us to be in the present moment and to enjoy God wherever we are now. That's a great question. Sarah, are you waving or?
I'm waving.
Yeah. Hi.
Thank you so much for your sermon on hope. I think it was a really very timely. When I think about hope, I think about two things. I think about the verse in Hebrew where they talk about faith being the assurance of things we hope for.
Yeah.
And I think about a quote by Cornel West where he says that he cannot be an optimist, but he's a prisoner of hope. And I'd like to model that in my life as well.
Yeah.
When I think about hope in my current work, I'm doing a lot of work in Guinea where I see a lot of death. And for me, hope is the assurance that God is with us and with all the people that we're with.
Yeah.
And that death for them is not the end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Sarah. I had a friend of mine who was a theologian, and he used to say, as a Christian, I'm neither an optimist or a pessimist. I'm a person of hope because Christ died and rose from the dead. To hold those, you can't separate those two things.
Thank you, Sarah.
I just, I want to ask, what do you do about people who want to take your hope away, the sort of like negative people in your life? I feel like whenever I sort of hold on to hope, I never feel like I have a really firm grasp on it. And anytime someone challenges me, I don't know what to say to them because my grasp on the hope isn't that strong.
Yeah.
Anyways, it's just kind of, I feel it slipping through my fingers, especially when it's challenged. Like I think of this one friend in particular who anytime I bring up post-COVID things, like I mentioned before, I'd like to have a wedding at some point, like, yeah, the legal thing, whatever. But I'm like, when we finally are able to get together with our families, and she's like, oh no, COVID isn't going anywhere. It's going to be like this for the next 10 years and blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, I can't what do you do about those people who just want to drag you down into their negativity? Yeah,
it's very difficult to know what to do, isn't it? Where people seem determined to sort of train you in the belief that all your dreams will die. It's kind of what do you do with that when you're facing that? So the way I would view that, I mean, there's lots of different ways of thinking about that. And it's very appropriate to the kind, like if you do sort of clinical work with people who are very profoundly depressed, just sitting in a room with people who as part of their condition, find it very, very difficult to hope. And so you have to hold the hope. So firstly, I would say that hope is something we usually have to grow. So if you have a very, very fragile sapling-like hope, you probably don't want to expose it to the worst elements. So you may have to just hold that in yourself, because you don't want to stick it out there to be frozen or destroyed by storms if other people haven't got it. The other thing is that hope isn't dependent on whether COVID goes away now or in 10 years' time. So even if COVID carries on for 10 years, there will still be hope. Even in that might not be the outcome we're looking for, but it's like if it doesn't go away next year or the year after that, this is where that notion of there's lots and lots of different ways of making this work that will work. Now, I think it's pretty unlikely that we'll be excluded from meeting one another for that period of time. But I think even if we were, I think there would still be hope in that period of situation. And in essence, what you're saying is, right now, you haven't really thought about how you would deal with that if that happened, but it sounds like your natural inclination is, okay, hadn't thought of it that way, but if that did happen, I'd still make it work. We'd still find some way of making meaningful, good contact with one another, even if that future is less than desirable for you. So what's happening is that person is just throwing, we said number 4, all the courses have obstacles in them. They're just throwing obstacles at you. And you don't necessarily have to have an answer to all of them. You can just, take that away. Okay, what would I do if that happened? But I would say primarily you hold the hope and defend it. It's like the candles on a birthday cake. You cover them with your hand while you're carrying them to the table so they don't get blown out before it's time. That sometimes you have to treat hope in that way to protect it.
I think it depends where you choose to put your focus too. You can choose to look at the hopeful things in life, or you can choose to look at the negative. In that situation, I haven't heard any scientists tell us yet that COVID will be with us for the next 10 years. We've got a vaccination program already begun and a whole host of people who've already recovered. So it's my choice and my preference, because it makes my life better, to be more hopeful and think that we will be better off than that.
The other thing to add as well is that Christianity does have this tendency to constantly look at the good exceptions as well, all the time. So if you think about any of the wonders or signs in the Bible, or so many parts of the biblical story are really stories that could have gone horribly wrong, and quite often suddenly something surprising occurs that's a real exception to what we would have expected. And I think that's part of hope too, is that idea of we just never quite know what's going to happen next. I often think about the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien saying that the reason he wrote Lord of the Rings is because we have a word catastrophe for moments where things go really, really horribly wrong. But we don't really have a word in English for when things go suddenly and unbelievably right. And the whole idea of the Lord of the Rings, of hobbits throwing a ring in a fire and it making the world better again, he called it eucatastrophe. We need a word that describes that. And he was speaking really very strongly out of his Christianity in saying that.
Thank you, Roger. I think this conversation could go on all day. It's so rich and really a great timing. What I will say is we'll continue now into a time of prayer. And if people want to hang around at the end of the service, we can continue the conversation. Does that sound good? Thank you.
Can I just say, Fiona, while you're doing that, I will find the links that people and put them in the chat. So I'll just do that before I go so that I make sure people have got those.
Thank you.